economically enslaving entire nations. So where would a poor nation get the funds to spend hundreds of millions or even billions with Maine? The money could be borrowed from the World Bank or similar sources. Minus graft and corruption, part of Maine's game plan, as they knew the opportunity for politicians to grab some loot helped sell the project, Maine would end up with handsome profits for their work. And what about the poor nation that was deeply in debt for an expensive boondoggle that never lived up to Maine's promises? The end result was sometimes a default that cost American and European taxpayers dearly. In most cases, the World Bank imposed strict controls on the debtor, destroying its independence and national sovereignty. Poor nations in search of an ego-boosting project weren't Maine's only source of income. Oil-rich Saudi Arabia and other Arab states were in serious need of infrastructure upgrades during the 70s and 80s. And Maine, along with its competitors, was quite willing to work with as a cash customer. His experience in the Peace Corps meant Perkins was somewhat different than the typical economic hitman. He enjoyed mingling with the local people and often wandered away from the plush hotels and the country clubs where well-connected foreigners hung together. Those first-hand experiences of how the impoverished masses lived, combined with his ever-growing salary and status, contributed to his doubts and growing inner turmoil about this sinister line of work. Even as such doubts grew, Perkins did whatever it took to close the sale. Among other favors, he lined up with Western prostitutes for Saudi clients. To further illustrate the strong big government, big business connection, properly known as fascism or Mussolini's corporate state, of Maine, Bechtel, and other multinationals, the Saudis were urged to put their ever-growing oil revenues into U.S. Treasury bonds. What could beat having a wealthy client who could be easily dazzled by phony numbers? As Perkins explained, from our perspective, the prospects for immense profits seem limitless. And to make the deal even sweeter, no one had to obtain congressional approval, a process loathed by corporations, particularly privately owned ones like Bechtel in Maine, who prefer not to open their books or share their secrets with anyone. The downside of destroying countries. Life as an economic hitman has some risks. Perkins found himself in Iran just before the overthrow of the Shah. An old college friend, an Iranian foreign exchange student, and several other locals warned Perkins to get out just before the Ayatollah Khomeini took over. And he boarded a plane on the eve of the revolution. Maine took a rare loss that time. It was on to Panama and Ecuador for Perkins. According to the author, Panamanian President Omar Torres was a staunch nationalist who wouldn't take the bait of millions in graft and kickbacks. The general wasn't a stereotypical Central American caricature. Perkins described Torres as a canny leader who had a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics. His negotiations with Jimmy Carter to regain control of the Panama Canal were shrewd and effective. Torres let Perkins know in no uncertain terms that he was well aware of the possibility of being assassinated by the CIA or traitors in his own circle. While he was willing to do business with Maine, Torres insisted that any project benefit all economic classes in Panama. Ecuadorian college professor Jaime Roldos won election as a populist candidate for president in '78. Part of his platform included regaining oil fields from Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, and Texaco, or at least getting a larger share of the proceeds. Perkins wrote, Roldos was the rare modern politician who was not afraid to oppose the status quo. Roldos struck me as a man who blazed the path struck by Torres. Both stood up to the world's strongest superpower. Like Torres, Roldos was not a communist, but rather stood for the rights of his country to determine its own destiny. And as they had with Torres, pundits predicted that big business in Washington would never tolerate Roldos as president. That last sentence says it all. Where does big business in Washington, fascism defined, get the right to run other nations? It's certainly not in the Constitution, nor was it ever advocated by the Founding Fathers. In sharp contrast to Perkins' assessment, the American mainstream media declared Toros and Roldos to be Marxist dictators. Both men died in mysterious aircraft crashes. Submitting to conscience at last. The inner turmoil continued to grow. It wasn't just the nature of the work that ate at Perkins. Where else could he earn the kind of lucrative salary and many perks that came with being a high-level manipulator? It's probably hard for the average person to understand just how enslaving such golden handcuffs can be. Perkins finally made the break, but kept silent about his work. His initial reluctance to talk paid off when Perkins went into the alternate energy field, as funding and investors came easy. It was no coincidence, but a reward for being a good soldier. His conscience still nagged and tugged. Perkins knew what could happen if he exposed this elitist oligarchy, but truth won out in the end, and the result is a tightly written story that grabs and holds the reader's attention. Reading Confessions of an Economic Hitman raises another question, as Perkins describes how small nations and their leaders are sold on lies that lead to debt, a loss of independence, and control by a cartel of financial tricksters. It makes one ponder if tens of millions of Americans bought the exact same pitch over the past 20 years. How many people bought cars, vacations, and especially homes they couldn't afford? Aside from a lack of thinking and impulsive behavior, how did this happen? Like Perkins' victims, a willingness to ignore reality and believe fantasies and propaganda led to taking on excessive, unsustainable debt and fiscal disaster. Maybe the economic hitmen turned their attention to America consumers after milking third world nations dry. But the question is, will Americans stand for this kind of abusive, exploitive treatment, or will they wake up and reinstitute just and constitutional government? The world in brief. Economic. Real personal income for Americans, excluding government payouts such as Social Security, has fallen by 3.2% since President Obama took office in January 2009, according to the Commerce Department's Bureau of Economic Analysis. 3 weeks after Congress passed its new national health care plan, support for repeal of the measure has risen 4 points to 58%. That includes 50% of U.S. voters who strongly favor repeal. Geopolitical. The vast majority of Russians believe order is more important than democracy. An opinion poll published on Monday by the Russia Public Opinion Research Center showed fully 72% of respondents preferred order to democracy, which was backed by just 16%. The figures have changed only slightly in 10 years. Social. A third of female British students would happily top up their funds by stripping, while 4% would consider escort work as a way to make ends meet. The findings, which will strike fear into the hearts of parents across the UK, came from a survey of 1,022 female students by Temp Work Webwise Student Gems. Barely a mile from the Georgia Capitol building, Metropolitan Parkway provides a straight thoroughfare for motorists traveling from downtown Atlanta to the airport. Metropolitan Parkway has garnered another odious distinction. It is widely considered to be the epicenter of child prostitution in the United States. A review of filings in the Thomson Reuters Westlaw legal database show foreclosures proceeding against U.S. churches have nearly tripled since December 2007, when the recession began compared with the previous 7 years, which included the dot-com bust and the economic downturn. Practical considerations. Pretty much, folks, just stock up. Stock up on food, water, seeds, ammo. Take care of you and yours. Peace out.